I had planned my wedding for 11 months. The flowers, white ranunculus and trailing green ivy, exactly as I had pictured them for years. The dress, a simple ivory crepe with a low back and no excess. The kind of dress that does not announce itself, but simply fits. The music, a string quartet playing something my grandmother had hummed to me as a child, so old and unhurried that it felt less like a wedding processional and more like a promise kept. The vows I had written by hand on a Tuesday night in February, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold beside me, while I tried to find words large enough for what I wanted to say to Daniel. What I had not planned was my own brother walking to the altar before me, turning to face 200 guests in the warm glow of a church I had loved since childhood, and announcing, in the measured, regretful tone of a man performing a reluctant duty, that this ceremony should stop. That there was something the family had kept quiet for too long. That Colette, he said, using my name the way you use a name when you want to create distance from it, did not truly belong in this family, and that before she married into another family's history, that truth deserved to be known. I stood at the entrance of that aisle in my ivory dress with my bouquet in both hands, and I listened to my brother say those words in front of every person I had ever loved. I did not cry. I want to tell you that clearly, because I think people expect tears in a moment like that, and I understand why, but there were no tears. What I felt instead was something colder and more complete, the specific sensation of watching a thing you have been quietly preparing for arrive exactly as you expected, in a form slightly worse than you imagined, but not fundamentally a surprise. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at my parents, who were seated in the front row and had gone so still they appeared to have stopped breathing. I looked at Reed, my brother, 3 years younger, standing at the altar that was supposed to be mine, and I reached into my bridal clutch. I removed a sealed white envelope. I walked to my father, Franklin, pressed the envelope into his hands, and said 4 words quietly enough that only he could hear them. I said, "Now you will know." Then I walked back down that aisle, through the 200 faces of people who had gathered to celebrate the beginning of something, and out of the church doors into the cold air of a Saturday morning in Renfield Harbor. I did not look back. The doors closed behind me with a sound I will never forget. Not a slam, not a dramatic punctuation mark, just a soft, definitive click, the sound of a chapter ending. My name is Colette Ashford. I am 31 years old, and what was in that envelope did not just tell the truth about me. It told the truth about all of us, about the secret my parents had built 31 years of our family's life on top of, about the distance I had always felt and never understood, about the thing Reed thought he was revealing when he stepped in front of me at that altar, and the thing he had no idea was also inside that envelope, waiting for exactly this moment to finally come to light. Before I take you back to the beginning, I want to ask you something. Have you ever spent years feeling the outline of a secret without being able to name it? Have you ever known, in the wordless, pre-language way that the body sometimes knows things before the mind catches up, that something important about your own life was being withheld from you? I grew up with that feeling. It was so constant, so familiar, that I mistook it for personality, for the ordinary ache of being a certain kind of person in a certain kind of family. It was not until I was 24 years old, standing in my parents' attic with a cardboard box in my hands, that I began to understand what I had actually been feeling all along. The Ashford family has been in Renfield Harbor for 3 generations. My grandfather built a small shipping supply company that my father, Franklin, eventually grew into something more substantial. The Ashford name carries weight in this town, in the specific way that old local names carry weight. Not glamorously, not in a way that makes headlines, but in the quiet, accumulated way of a family that has been part of the same place long enough that its name appears on plaques and in historical photographs, and in the kind of casual references people make when they are explaining who someone is to someone who just moved here. My mother, Mariette, grew up in Renfield Harbor too, 3 streets over from where Franklin grew up, and they have the particular ease with each other that people develop when they have known each other since before they had anything interesting to say. They are a unit, Franklin and Mariette, in the deep, unspoken way of people who have organized their entire sense of the world around each other for so long that the seam between them is invisible. I watched them my entire childhood, and I found them beautiful and slightly impenetrable. Like a house whose lights you can see from the street, but whose front door you cannot quite find. Reed arrived 3 years after me, and from the very beginning he slid into this family the way water slides into a container that was made for it. He had Franklin's jaw and Mariette's eyes, and the specific ease of a person who has never once walked into a room and wondered whether he belonged there. He was good at everything that the Ashford family valued: sports, social confidence, the ability to work a room with the same natural warmth that Franklin had, as though it were a genetic inheritance passed directly from father to son without effort or instruction. I was different, and I knew it from an early age, though I had no framework for understanding why. I was quieter than the rest of them, more inward. I preferred books to parties and small, specific conversations to large social gatherings, which put me at an angle to almost everything the Ashfords excelled at. I looked different, too. My coloring was darker than either of my parents, my features arranged differently, my height and build from somewhere the family tree didn't obviously account for. I noticed this in photographs. I noticed it in the way certain relatives would look at me and then at Reed and smile at him in a way that had warmth in it that their smile at me did not. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to make my parents into villains, or at least not into the simple kind. Franklin and Mariette loved me. I believe that now as certainly as I believe anything. But there is a specific way of loving someone from whom you are withholding a truth about themselves, and that way of loving has a texture to it that the person being loved can feel even when they cannot name it. It is love administered through a kind of guilt that the giver cannot acknowledge, and so it arrives slightly off-center, slightly managed, slightly at a distance from the full, unguarded warmth that people give when they have nothing to hide. I felt that distance my entire childhood without understanding it. I filed it under personality, mine and theirs. I told myself I was simply a different kind of person from the rest of them, that families produce outliers, that not everyone fits perfectly into the household they grow up in, and that this was fine and normal and nothing to grieve. I was very good at telling myself things were fine. I had been practicing since I was old enough to notice they were not. Reed and I were not enemies growing up. I want to say that clearly because the story of that Saturday morning makes it easy to assume we always were. We were not close. The gap between us was not just 3 years, but something less measurable. A difference in the quality of how we each experienced the same household. And that difference created a distance that neither of us had language for, and so neither of us ever really addressed. We were polite to each other. We celebrated each other's achievements with the mechanical warmth of people fulfilling an obligation they did not dislike, but did not feel particularly deeply. We were siblings in the administrative sense of the word. Same address, same parents, same last name. Two people whose lives ran alongside each other without much genuine intersection. I did not understand why, until I was 24 years old, standing in my parents' attic with a cardboard box in my hands and the particular quality of afternoon light that comes through a small attic window at the end of summer, yellow and slanted, and making everything slightly more significant than it might otherwise appear, and I found the thing that explained all of it. Daniel Mercer came into my life at 27, through the kind of unremarkable circumstances that the best things in life tend to arrive through: a mutual friend's birthday dinner, a conversation that started about something forgettable and went somewhere neither of us planned. He is from Hartwell Crossing, a town about 40 minutes from Renfield Harbor, and his family has the same kind of rooted local history that mine does, which meant that our engagement, when it happened 2 years later, was treated by both sets of parents as something close to a natural conclusion to a story that had always been heading in this direction. Except for Reed. From the moment our engagement was announced, Reed's attitude toward Daniel shifted in a way I noticed but initially could not make sense of. He was not rude to Daniel directly. Reed is not a person who expresses things directly if an indirect route is available. But there was a coolness, a withholding of the easy warmth he extended to everyone else in our social circle that Daniel noticed too and mentioned to me once, carefully, not wanting to cause trouble, but also not wanting to pretend it wasn't there. I spoke to Reed about it once, about 6 months before the wedding. I asked him, simply and without accusation, whether he had any reservations about Daniel. Reed said no. He said Daniel was fine. He said the word fine in a way that carried more freight than the word itself could hold, and then he changed the subject. I let him. I had things I was also not saying, and I understood, between us, that we were both sitting on opposite sides of the same silence. The morning of the wedding, before I had finished having my hair arranged, my phone showed a message from Reed. It said, "We need to talk before the ceremony. I need 5 minutes." I did not respond immediately. An hour later, he appeared at the door of the room where I was getting ready, asked the others to give us a moment, and stood in front of me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not his usual smooth social confidence, but something more pressured, more urgent, with an edge of something that might have been guilt if I had been reading him more generously. He told me I should think carefully about whether to go through with the ceremony. He told me there were things about our family, things about me specifically, that had the potential to embarrass the Ashford name if they became public at a moment like this. He told me he was thinking about the family's reputation. He told me he had become aware of certain information that, in his view, I should have disclosed to Daniel before proceeding to the altar. I asked him, very quietly, what information he was referring to. He said I knew what he meant. I looked at my brother for a long moment. I had spent 11 months planning a wedding and 7 years carrying a secret, and 31 years living inside a family that had built its warmth around a gap it never named. And I had prepared for exactly this possibility. Not because I had known Reed would choose my wedding day, but because I had known, with the specific knowledge of someone who has spent a lifetime reading the rooms she grew up in, that the secret would eventually become a weapon in someone's hands. And I had made sure I was ready when it did. I told Reed I was going to walk to that altar. I told him whatever he needed to do was his choice. And I walked back to my mirror and picked up my bouquet. Reed left the room, and 15 minutes later, when I walked to the entrance of that church aisle and the string quartet began to play my grandmother's song, I watched my brother walk to the altar ahead of me and turn to face the room. And I understood, with complete and terrible clarity, that he had decided. He spoke for about 90 seconds. I am not going to reproduce everything he said, because some of it belongs to a particular ugliness that I have chosen not to carry in full detail. The shape of it was this. He told the room that the Ashford family had always been committed to honesty, that he believed in the sanctity of marriage beginning with full truth, and that there were questions about Colette's origins and her place in the family that he believed, out of respect for everyone present, deserved to be raised before the ceremony proceeded. He did not say the word adopted. He was careful enough not to say it, but the implication moved through that church like weather, felt before it was understood, impossible to miss once it arrived. I watched my parents in the front row. Franklin went rigid, the complete, motionless stillness of a man watching something he spent decades preventing unfold in front of him in a setting he cannot control. Mariette's hand found his arm and gripped it. Her face was the face of someone experiencing something they have dreaded for so long that the actual arrival of it is almost a relief. Almost, but not quite. Because relief requires the thing to be over, and this was only beginning. I want to ask you something about that moment, about standing at the entrance of an aisle while someone uses the truth of your life as a tool against you in front of the people you love most. Because I want you to understand something that I think gets lost in stories like this when they are told quickly. The cruelty of what Reed did was not simply in what he said, it was in his timing. He chose the most significant public moment of my adult life to make himself the person who told the truth. As though the telling of it was an act of integrity, when what it actually was an act of ownership. He wanted to own the story of my origins before I could. Have you ever had someone take the truest thing about you and announce it, without your permission, as though it were theirs to share? 7 years earlier, I had found a cardboard box while helping my parents clear space in their attic for a new storage system. It was an ordinary box, the kind that moving companies give you and that never quite gets fully unpacked, pushed to the back of a shelf behind holiday decorations and old tax files. My mother had called up the stairs and asked me to set aside anything that looked personal before tossing anything. I had pulled the box from the shelf, set it on the attic floor in the beam of yellow window light, and opened it. Inside were letters and a few official-looking documents, folded and slightly yellowed at the edges, the way paper yellows when it has been sitting in a box for decades without being touched. I did not read them carefully. I was 24, I was in a hurry, and there was a particular quality to the handwriting on the top letter, personal, clearly private, that made me feel I was intruding on something not meant for me. I did what any person does when they have the instinct that they are holding something significant but are not ready to know what it is. I photographed everything. All of it, quickly, with my phone. And then I put the box back exactly where I found it and went downstairs and did not think about it for 3 more years. I think often about that version of myself, the 24-year-old who photographed those documents without reading them and put them away. There is something in that instinct that I understand better now than I did then. I was not ready. There is a kind of readiness that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with having enough of yourself assembled before you look at the thing that will rearrange what you thought you knew. At 24, I was not yet assembled enough. At 27, sitting on the floor of my apartment one evening with no particular reason to look at old photographs on my phone, I opened them and began to read. What I found, across those documents and letters, was this. A letter from a woman named Sasha, handwritten, addressed to Mariette, dated 31 years earlier, a month before I was born. In it, Sasha wrote with the fragile, over-careful language of someone very young trying to hold themselves together in an impossible situation. She said she could not keep the baby. She said she had thought about it for months and had tried every other option she could imagine, and there was no version of the life ahead of her that included raising a child alone at 19 without any support. She said she trusted Mariette. She said she knew that Mariette and Franklin would give the baby everything she could not. She said she was asking them to take the baby and raise her as their own, and that she would not seek contact, would not make claims, would simply disappear from the equation so that the child could grow up whole and unconfused. There was a second document, a private arrangement between Sasha and the Ashfords, typed on plain paper and signed by all 3 of them, laying out the terms of the arrangement. No attorney had drawn it up. No court had formalized it. It was a private agreement between 3 people in a desperate situation, trying to solve an unsolvable problem without involving institutions that might have complicated things. And there was a third document, a copy of my original birth certificate, amended in a way that listed Franklin and Mariette as my biological parents, which Eleanor Vass, the attorney I would eventually consult, would later explain to me was not standard adoption procedure and involved documentation that was, at minimum, legally irregular. I sat on the floor of my apartment and I read all of it 3 times. And then I sat for a very long time without moving, while the apartment went dark around me, and I did not get up to turn on a light. I was not crying. I was doing something that had no name exactly. Something between remembering and revising, going back through 31 years of small moments and understanding them differently. The distance I had always felt, the way Franklin looked at Reed and the way he looked at me, and the almost imperceptible difference in those 2 expressions that I had spent my entire childhood telling myself I was imagining. The managed love, the warmth administered through a layer of something I now had a name for. Guilt. I did not call my parents that night. I did not call them the next day, or the day after that. I made an appointment with Eleanor Vass for the following week, and I went to her office and laid the documents in front of her and asked her to tell me what I was looking at. She told me, carefully and professionally, that what I had found was evidence of a private, informal adoption arrangement that had not followed standard legal procedures, and that the amended birth certificate raised questions about the documentation process that a formal investigation could examine. She also offered, through her professional network, to help me locate Sasha if I wanted. I said yes. I asked her to help me find Sasha. It took 6 weeks. Eleanor found her in a city 4 states away, a quiet life, a small apartment, a job in a library. A woman who had been 19 years old and alone, and had made the only decision she believed was available to her, and who had spent 30 years carrying the weight of that decision in a life that continued without ever resolving it. Eleanor reached out through an intermediary. Sasha agreed to meet. We met in a coffee shop in a city neither of us lived in. Neutral ground, the kind of place where no one knows anyone. She was 50 years old, and she had my coloring, and the particular arrangement of her features was familiar in a way that bypassed my thinking mind completely and landed directly in my body. I recognized her the way you recognize something you never knew you had been looking for. We talked for 3 hours. She told me everything. About being 19 and alone, about her friendship with Mariette, about the arrangement that had felt like the only loving thing she could do and had broken her heart every year since. She told me she had wondered about me constantly. She told me she had not sought contact because she had promised she would not, and because she believed, truly believed, that the promise was the last real thing she could give me, the gift of a life uncomplicated by her presence. She told me she was sorry. Not for giving me up. She said she could not apologize for the thing that she still believed, painfully, had been the right decision. But for the absence itself, for the gap she had left in me that I had spent 30 years walking around without knowing its shape. I drove home from that city in a kind of silence I have never fully described to anyone. It was not sad, exactly. It was not joyful. It was the particular silence of someone whose picture of themselves has just acquired a dimension it previously lacked. I was the same person I had been that morning, and I was someone I had not yet fully met. I want to ask you something about this part of the story, because I think it is the part that people most often misunderstand when I tell it. People assume that discovering you were adopted must be primarily about the parents who adopted you, about betrayal, about the secret they kept. And that was part of it, yes. But the larger experience, the one that took longer to process and mattered more in the end, was the experience of meeting the shape of yourself for the first time, of understanding the outline of a mystery you had been living inside without knowing it had an answer. Have you ever found out something true about yourself that made the confusion of your whole life suddenly make sense? It is disorienting. And it is also, in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it, a profound and unexpected relief. After the meeting with Sasha, I went home and I made a decision that I want to explain carefully, because I think it is easy to misread. I decided not to confront my parents immediately, not because I was afraid, and not because I forgave them in any simple way, but because I wanted to give them the chance to tell me themselves. I had just discovered that I had been adopted, that the arrangement had been legally irregular, and that my parents had carried the secret for my entire life. I understood the fear that had kept them silent, the fear of what telling me might mean, for me and for them, and for the family they had built. I understood it without excusing it. And I thought, they should have the chance to be the ones who tell me. I should give them that chance before I make any other move. For 2 years, I waited. I went to family dinners. I celebrated Christmas at the house on the corner of Ashford Lane where I had grown up. I sat at the table where Franklin said grace every Sunday, and I passed the bread, and I answered questions about my life and Daniel's life, and I watched my parents' faces for any sign that they were ready to say the thing they had never said. They were not ready, or they were afraid, or they had made the specific calculation that the longer the secret was kept, the harder it became to find the words for it, and so they had simply kept going, hoping that going was enough. During those 2 years, I assembled the envelope. It took longer than assembling it sounds because each element required thought about what I was doing and why. The copies of the original attic documents, the formal findings Eleanor had prepared, and the thing that mattered most, the letter Sasha had written at my request, addressed to no one in particular, describing who I had been before the Ashfords named me. Not an accusation, not a claim, simply a truth, told in the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years being quiet and had agreed, finally, to speak. I addressed the envelope to Franklin, not to both my parents, to Franklin specifically, because it was Franklin who had signed the papers. It was Franklin whose name anchored the legal irregularity that Eleanor had identified. It was Franklin who had made the decision, in the end, about how this family's story would be told and who would be allowed to know it. And it was Franklin who, I had come to understand over 2 years of watching him at dinner tables and Christmas gatherings, was the one most likely to understand the weight of what he was holding once the envelope was in his hands. I carried that envelope in my bridal clutch on my wedding day, not because I expected to need it, but because I had learned, over the years of knowing what I knew while pretending I did not know it, that secrets announce themselves on their own schedule, not yours. I had thought the most likely moment was a quiet evening, a private conversation, a door finally opened by my parents themselves. I had not thought it would be a Saturday morning in front of 200 people, but I had prepared for any morning. And when Reed stepped in front of me at that altar and began to speak, I understood that the moment had chosen itself, as moments tend to do, without consulting anyone's preferences. What I want you to understand about that envelope, before I tell you what happened when Franklin opened it, is that it was not an act of revenge. I have had to be very clear with myself about this, because the circumstances of how and where I gave it to him make it easy to read it that way. It was not revenge. It was a reckoning. There is a difference. Revenge is about making someone pay. Reckoning is about making sure that the truth is in the room. I did not want anyone to suffer. I wanted the thing that had been hidden to be found. I wanted the story of my life to be told in its complete form, and I wanted my father to hold the fullness of it in his hands before anyone else in that room had the chance to define it. And now you are at the moment I suspect you have been waiting for since I started this story. You want to know what happened when Franklin opened that envelope in a church full of people who had just watched his son announce his daughter's secret at her wedding. You want to know what the room looked like, what Franklin's face looked like, what happened to Reed when the contents of that envelope made themselves known. I understand. I want to tell you. But first, if this story is landing with you, if you have ever been the person in the room that someone else tried to define before you could define yourself, please subscribe to this channel. New stories like this one arrive every week, and they are always free. Just click subscribe. It takes 1 second. Now let me tell you what was inside that church after I walked out. I sat in the car that had been meant to carry me to my reception, a cream-colored car with white ribbons on the antenna that now seemed to belong to a different story entirely, and I looked at the stone face of the church, and I breathed, in and out, slowly. The way you breathe when you need to remind yourself that your body is still operating normally, even though everything else is not. Daniel found me 12 minutes later. He had come through a side door of the church, still in his suit, his expression the expression of a man who has just witnessed something he did not have a category for and is trying, with everything he has, not to make it worse by reacting before he understands it. He opened the car door and sat down beside me without saying anything. He took my hand. He looked straight ahead through the windscreen at the street and the trees and the ordinary Saturday morning that was continuing around us without any awareness of what had just happened inside that church. I told him everything, all of it, start to finish, in the order it happened, the attic, the photographs, the documents, Eleanor, Sasha, the coffee shop 4 states away, the 2 years of dinners and Christmases, and the envelope in my clutch that had been waiting for the moment it was needed. I talked for a long time. Daniel did not interrupt. He held my hand, and he listened with the quality of attention that I had loved about him since the first conversation we ever had. The kind that makes you feel that what you are saying is the most important thing currently happening in the world. When I finished, we sat in silence for a moment. Then Daniel said, very quietly, "Why did you not tell me?" I said, "Because I did not know if it would ever need to be told." I said I had hoped my parents would tell me themselves, and that if they had, I would have told him everything in my own time. I said I was sorry that the first time he heard it was in a church with 200 people, delivered by my brother as a weapon. Daniel was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Colette, I want to marry you. That has not changed. Not today, not because of anything that happened in that church. Whenever you are ready, today or next week or next year, I am standing at whatever altar you want to stand at. You only have to say when." I held his hand tighter. I did not say anything. Sometimes a thing is said exactly right, and the only response is to feel it completely. Inside the church, the envelope was doing what it had been assembled to do. I was not there to see it in real time, but I have since been told by several relatives what happened after I walked out, and the picture they describe is one I have gone over many times in the months since. Franklin opened the envelope in his pew while the church was still sorting itself out from what Reed had said, guests uncertain whether to stay or go, some already leaving, the priest standing at the altar with the expression of a man who has conducted many services and never one quite like this. Franklin read the contents without changing his expression for the first several minutes, in the careful, controlled way of a man who has spent a lifetime maintaining composure in difficult situations. But the documents were detailed, and Sasha's letter was long, and somewhere in the reading of it, his composure left him. Not in a dramatic way, simply in the way that composure leaves a person when what they are reading is the full truth of something they have spent 31 years managing in pieces. The wholeness of it, finally assembled in one place by someone else's hands, arriving as something larger than the sum of what he had always kept separated. Mariette, beside him, saw his face and asked what was in it. He showed her. She read a portion of it and then pressed her hand against her mouth and began to cry. Not the controlled, dignified tears of a woman performing grief for an audience, but something rawer and less managed. Several relatives who were still in the building and watching saw this and understood, without being told explicitly, that whatever Reed had intended to expose had just been dramatically overtaken by something he had not anticipated. Reed himself, who had been standing near the altar in the particular posture of a man waiting to be thanked for something, saw his parents' reaction and understood, too late by several minutes, in the specific too late that means it cannot be undone, that the envelope I had handed our father contained something he had not known was inside it. He had known I was adopted. He had not known about Eleanor's findings regarding the irregular documentation. He had not known about Sasha's letter. He had not known that his sister had spent 2 years assembling a complete and documented account of the truth, and that by forcing the moment himself, he had simply determined the setting in which it was delivered. He had meant to expose me. Instead, he had been the one to open a door that he could not close again, into a room that turned out to contain far more than he had known was there. Franklin called my phone that afternoon. I did not answer. He called 3 more times before evening. Each time I watched his name on the screen and did not pick up. I was not ready yet. I had spent 2 years being ready for the right moment. I was allowed to take 1 afternoon before I spoke to him. I sat with Daniel in the quiet of our apartment, still in my wedding dress because I had nowhere to change, and neither of us had thought to suggest it. And we ordered food and watched something on television that I could not afterward have described, and I let the day end the way it needed to end. Not neatly, not resolved, but over. I want to ask you this because I think about it often, and I think it matters. When someone tries to take the story of your life out of your hands and tell it for you, without your permission, in the worst possible setting, what do you owe them in response? Is it anger? Is it silence? Is it the carefully prepared truth that makes their interference irrelevant? I did not arrive at a clean answer. But sitting in that car with Daniel's hand in mine, watching the church in front of us, I understood something that I want to share with you. The story of your life cannot be taken from you by someone else's announcement. It belongs to you. You are always the author. Whatever Reed said in that church, whatever he intended with those words, the envelope I left said something different. And the envelope was mine. Daniel and I were married 3 months later on a Thursday afternoon. 12 people. A small room above a restaurant that had been in Renfield Harbor since before either of us was born. No speeches, no processional, no string quartet, though I have since thought that I would still like to use that music someday, at some quieter occasion, the way you use something that was meant for a purpose that changed before it arrived. A justice of the peace and the vows I had written on that Tuesday night in February, which I read aloud to Daniel, with my voice very steady and his eyes very full, and which turned out to be exactly the right words for exactly the right room. The 12 people were the 12 people who mattered. Daniel's parents, who had heard the full story from Daniel by the Sunday after the church, and who had responded with a kindness I had not fully anticipated and will not forget. Several of our closest friends, Margot, who had been my closest friend since we were 19, and who had spent the Saturday afternoon of the original wedding sitting with me on the floor of my apartment in my dress, not saying anything helpful, and therefore saying everything helpful. And my mother, Mariette. I had not included Franklin. That was a deliberate choice, made after a great deal of thought, and I want to explain it without making it sound simpler than it was. Franklin had written me a letter, a long, careful, genuinely difficult letter that I have read many times. He admitted the arrangement. He admitted the years of managing a guilt he had never found a way to put down. He admitted that the distance I had always felt had been real, and that it had come not from a failure of love, but from a failure of honesty, from the specific way that loving someone through a secret you are keeping from them makes the love arrive bent. He said he was sorry. He said it multiple times and in multiple ways, and I believed him in each version of it. But I was not ready to stand beside him at an altar, even a small one, even a Thursday afternoon above a restaurant with 12 people and no processional. Some readiness cannot be rushed. I had learned that from 2 years of photographed documents sitting on my phone, waiting for the day I was assembled enough to open them. I gave Franklin time. I told him, through a letter of my own, that I was not closing a door. I was simply not yet ready to walk through it. He wrote back and said he would wait. Mariette was different. Mariette had not made the arrangement. She had been part of it, certainly, but the decision, the paperwork, the specific choices about documentation had been Franklin's. And Mariette's grief, when it came, had a quality to it that I recognized as genuine in a way that moved something in me. She called me 2 weeks after the original wedding day, and she did not try to explain. She simply said, "I should have told you. I have known I should have told you for 31 years, and I did not find the courage. And I am going to be sorry for that for the rest of my life." I said, "I know, Mom." I had not called her that in the weeks between the church and that phone call. It came out before I decided to say it, the way things come out when they have been true for your whole life, regardless of what the last few weeks contained. She cried. I let her. We stayed on the phone for an hour, mostly quietly, the way people stay on the phone when the conversation they needed to have has been had, and what is left is simply the presence of each other. Reed is another matter. What Reed chose to do at that altar, the specific combination of the setting and the timing and the framing of it, as a performance of family integrity rather than the act of cruelty it actually was, cost him in ways I had not specifically planned for, but do not pretend I am entirely unmoved by. Several family members who had witnessed what he did, and who learned in the months afterward what the envelope contained and what Eleanor's findings were not forgiving. Not because they were loyal to me in any calculated way, but because there is a particular kind of wrong that is visible, even to people who are not directly affected by it. The kind that chooses the most vulnerable public moment to reveal itself. Reed has not apologized to me. I do not expect him to. I have spent enough time thinking about Reed's motivations, the specific combination of resentment and opportunism, and whatever fear was underneath both of those things, to understand that an apology would require him to look at what he did without the protective frame of it having been about family integrity, and I am not sure he is yet capable of that. Perhaps he will be someday. I am not holding my life in suspension waiting for it. I met Sasha again, 7 months after the wedding. A longer meeting this time, in the same city, a different coffee shop, an easier afternoon. We talked about ordinary things alongside the large ones, her library, my work, the particular qualities of the town she lived in and the town I had grown up in. The conversation had room for laughter in it, which the first one had not, and I found that the laughter felt like progress of a kind that I could not have named precisely, but recognized when it arrived. We are not mother and daughter in any way I have found a comfortable language for yet. We are two people connected by the most significant possible thing, and still in the early stages of understanding what to do with that connection. It is enough. For now, it is genuinely enough. I think about belonging a great deal in the months since everything happened, about what it means to belong to a family, whether belonging is biological or chosen, or something assembled over time from the specific accumulation of shared meals and arguments and silences, and the 10,000 ordinary moments that are the actual material of family life. I think about what it means to be loved by people who are also keeping something from you, and whether the love and the keeping can be held separately, or whether they are always, inevitably, the same thing experienced from different angles. I have not arrived at clean answers to any of this. I am not sure clean answers are available. What I have instead is something more modest and, I think, more true. A marriage that began in a parking lot in my wedding dress and became, 3 months later, a Thursday afternoon above a restaurant with 12 people and vows I had written by hand on a Tuesday night in February. A mother who called and said, "I should have told you," and was right. A father who wrote a letter and is waiting. A biological mother who met me twice across a small table and laughed, the second time, at something I said. A brother who chose a moment that I will never fully forgive him for, and who is living, now, in the long shadow of that choice. And so here is the last question I want to leave you with. Not about family secrets, not about betrayal, not even about justice, though this story has been about all of those things. The question I want to leave you with is simpler than any of that. It is this. Have you ever discovered that the thing which was used to make you feel like you did not belong was actually the thing that proved, more completely than anything else could have, that you do? Because that is what happened in that church. Reed stood at my altar and announced that I was not fully one of them, and in doing so, he handed me the envelope I had been carrying for 2 years. He gave me the moment. He gave me the room. He gave me the audience. And everything that followed was simply the truth doing what the truth always does, given half a chance. It stood up. It was seen. It did not go back down. My name is Colette. A man who was supposed to be my brother told 200 people that I did not belong in my family. I walked out of that church without a word, and the envelope I left behind said everything that needed to be said, not by me, but by the truth that had been waiting inside it for 2 years, patient and complete, ready for exactly the moment it was finally allowed to arrive. If you have ever been told, in any form, by anyone, that you do not belong somewhere that is yours, I want you to know this. Belonging is not something another person can revoke with a sentence. It is not something that can be taken away by an announcement at an altar or a whisper at a dinner table. or a lifetime of love administered at arm's length. Belonging is not given by other people. It was yours before they had an opinion about it. It will be yours after. All you have to do is refuse to hand it over. I kept mine, and I walked back out into the morning with it still completely, entirely mine.